Hello and welcome to another edition of Labor's Worldview TV. I'm your host, David Johnson, here today with my co-host,
Jim Eyeman. David's going to ask some questions of our guests we have today from Occupy the Air on WEFT on Saturday mornings from noon to 3 o'clock.
Okay, first of all, we'll introduce our guests. We'll start with, I guess, Matt. Do you want to introduce yourself and just kind of give us just a little brief biography about yourself?
Well, sure. My name is Matt Murphy, and I have been co-hosting Occupy the Air on WEFT for about 10 weeks now. Really been interested in the Occupy movement since early October when it first kicked off, and been participating actively with the movement here in various forms, going to the general assemblies, the rallies, and also a lot of the planning committee meetings, and this seemed like a natural follow-up to that.
Okay, Sean?
Hi, my name is Sean Seckler, and I've also been involved since about October with the Occupy movement, and I work in town at the College of Media. Matt and I kind of got together around October. We had sort of passed around a media sign-up sheet at one of our GAs looking for people that were interested in getting involved in community media to try and get the news of Occupy out to at least the local community.
Okay, and when you say GA, you refer to the General Assembly, is that correct?
Yeah, the
Okay.
General Assembly of the local Occupy CU group.
Okay, and that's sort of like the general meeting where like people, you got also committee meetings to where they're specifically oriented towards like media or other things, and then everybody comes together from the committees and just whoever happens to first come, for instance, to a meeting at the General Assemblies. Is that correct?
Yeah, there have been a lot of spin-offs of the GA since it started.
Mm-hmm.
It's a good place for people to tap in and see what the possibilities are within the movement.
Mm-hmm.
And it's been ongoing weekly since, I think, early October. I missed the first one or two.
Yeah.
Started
Okay.
at the Clark Bar in downtown
That's
Champaign.
right.
It was very, very informal, and the structure of the GA has fluctuated a bit between very informal and somewhat formal. But yeah, it's ongoing and still a good way for people to find out what the possibilities are within the movement.
Yeah, speaking of that meeting, that first meeting at the Clark Bar, that informal meeting, I couldn't make it that evening, but a friend of mine went, and right after the meeting, she called me and said, "David, you're not going to believe this. There was like 60 people there, and I don't know half of them." So she was really thrilled. I mean, it seemed like when this Occupy movement started in Zuccotti Park in New York City, it just sparked a lot of enthusiasm and imagination, nationwide, worldwide too. So, but tell us about what interested you guys, about the Occupy movement. What was the compelling thing that really drew you toward that and wanting to get involved locally?
Well, I was really surprised at the number of people that were involved. I think the first couple of meetings that I attended, we had easily 50 or 60 people, and I guess my interest was just that I've been an advocate for social services and affordable housing in a community in Georgia for about the last 10 years.
That was Athens, Georgia?
Athens, Georgia, right, another
Okay.
college town.
Yeah.
And just moved here in the summer. So I was kind of in that wonderful position of having some free time and being able to do what I wanted. And then this thing happened.
Mm-hmm.
And it was like, wow, this is really great. Suddenly lots of people are talking about the same issues that I've been talking about for years: income inequality, the plight of working families and how difficult it is, and the reduction in social services and the social safety net. And now lots of people were talking about it together. So it was really, I think, encouraging to see how many people were coming together from really all walks of life. There were a lot of students involved, a lot of working class folks, just a broad spectrum of people. So in the first couple of months I was here, I think I made 300 new friends.
Okay, and Sean, what inspired you when you saw what was happening in New York City?
That was a very inspiring vision, actually, and for me it was sort of the opportunity to have political discussion, because for a long time I just found myself sort of not isolated, but I had a small group of friends that I could talk politics with, and outside of that it seemed very unwanted. Political discussion seemed a bit faux pas, or I don't know the correct term, but it was just something you didn't bring up in polite conversation. And now it seemed like, well, there's suddenly this reawakening of popular discussion of political issues. I've been talking about this and complaining about not having a venue for it, so here's my opportunity to go discuss these issues with people and, you know, put my talk where my mouth is, you know,
Okay.
or has been for so long.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I believe that I've not seen anything so encouraging in my life since the 60s and SDS and the anti-war movement and civil rights movement as the Occupy movement. It's different. It's organized different, but it seems like it's kind of an umbrella organization where members of various organizations can go and have something in common with. And we're doing our best to get involved in everything that they're involved with. But Matt, you mentioned Athens, Georgia. I heard this week now that there's a free university somewhere near Athens. They're not saying where, for students that have not been able to qualify because they're not citizens.
That's right.
They're illegal aliens. And
On which planet, Jim?
yeah, well, but this reminds me of the Freedom Schools in the early 60s, 1964, in fact, where the black students just walked out, set up schools in the churches until the demands of the community to upgrade the schools and better programs were met. And it was a strike in effect, but it was 90% effective. And at some point, I think we're going to have to go back to that. What's happening in the school system is just out of sight. But anyway, I did want to ask you guys, at some point, if you want to do it now or a little bit later. Last week, you took up the question of H.R. 347, which is a national bill that's taking away a great deal of our rights and liberties. Our First Amendment is in danger with this. So whichever one of you guys would like to get into that.
Yeah, that's something that we've been really concerned about. We started talking about the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act, which was the first, I guess, recent attack on civil liberties. We were also very concerned about SOPA and PIPA, and now, of course, this that you mentioned. Sean, I think, has done a lot more of the research on this than I have, but it's really scary, the rate at which they are attacking sort of our civil liberties, our freedom to assemble, freedom of speech. So yeah, that's something we're very concerned about.
Yeah, to me, H.R. 347, from what I've been able to gather online and sources like the ACLU, it seems like it's another further ratcheting away of our civil liberties, in that it's not completely legislating in a new arena. There was a law in '71 passed addressing Secret Service protection, areas around people being protected by the Secret Service, and national special security events, things that have lately been the Super Bowl, but also the Republican National Convention, things like that. But slowly over time, and I think 2 times before this, the law has been changed to broaden what is a criminal act, and so it's again, you know, a further, you know, it's another inch of your civil rights that's being taken away, and I think it's not completely coincidental that this legislation is coming out when it's coming out, given that we have the Occupy movement so successful in the last few months at raising public awareness and protesting and mic checking people, and the upcoming events in Chicago this May, the NATO meeting up there. There have already been local ordinances issued to make it more difficult and much more costly in terms of protesting up there. And this is sort of a national, much more far-reaching ratcheting away of our civil liberties.
To what extent do you fellows agree with me that I believe Occupy is responsible, if not exclusively, in large part to this? This movement has scared them. We've got, I think the when the 700 of Occupy Wall Street were arrested on the Brooklyn Bridge, suddenly everybody had to look. It was one of the biggest, if not the biggest, mass arrest in U.S. history. But any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think clearly these actions are in direct response to the success and the momentum that came about from the various Occupy movements. And I think we're certainly seeing local governments and cities looking for ways to prevent these sort of protests. Obviously the encampments, most of which have been evacuated or evicted. But this general trend, I think, towards trying to find legal ways to prevent us from exercising our free speech rights and our First Amendment rights is clearly a response to the success that we've had in capturing people's imagination.
In what way, Matt, specifically, which rights are being taken away, and how are they being taken away in this act?
Well, I can't speak to the details of this particular act, but one of the central tenets of the Occupy movement nationwide is sort of reclaiming public space. You know, there was this idea that you could protest or picket or occupy a space outside of City Hall or in a public park, and we tried that here. Of course, it's a much smaller community than Chicago or Oakland or New York. But we rapidly found out that there's all sorts of permitting and there's all sorts of regulations that prevent you from camping overnight in various places. And we sort of clandestinely tried to do that on the quad a few times. But you really don't have a right to assemble in what you think are public spaces. They're really not public spaces anymore. They've been very heavily regulated. So where do you go if you have a protest? I mean, your free speech zones have become smaller and smaller and sort of more and more marginalized. You actually have to resist, and we talked a lot about civil disobedience. You know, to what level would we resist the legal requirements to evacuate a park at 11 p.m., things like that. So the movement here, I think, was sort of divided. A lot of people were sort of willing to push right up against that boundary and say, no, we have a free speech right. We want to be where we want to be. But a large segment of the movement is not really there yet. They certainly support this public protest and a public occupation. But I don't know if they're quite ready to break the law, and that's what I think is so damaging about these sorts of like HR 347 is that it's actually making it illegal for you to exploit your not rights as a citizen.
Yes, I believe it also makes it a felony offense.
Exactly.
With a minimum max of a year in prison. It is a very pernicious thing. They can set up zones around a Republican convention, around the Democratic Party convention, really anywhere they want, and say this is a national security zone.
Yeah, the discretion is very broad, and it's given to Homeland Security to say what a national security event is. So we have yet to see what will be a national security event. Maybe from now on it'll be every time somebody gets mic checked or has the possibility of being mic checked. But with regard to 347, specifically, the ACLU article I saw was saying that the way that this was a danger suppose that it was broadening what is a felony offense, in that before you had to both knowingly and willfully violate this restricted zone, and now it's been more loosely described as just knowingly. So it's a very illegal, out in the weeds kind of argument, but all the legal authorities at ACLU are saying it is, a further ratcheting away of your rights. The NDAA seems more pernicious in that it's going to allow for the indefinite detention of American citizens on American soil, potentially. They keep saying that they won't do it, and they have had a Senate hearing last week to sort of hash over the unpopular details about indefinite detention of American citizens, but so far nothing's really been forthcoming out of that hearing.
But Magna Carta from 1218 AD is in trouble.
Yeah, we're back there.
Yeah, and one has to beg the question is what's brought this on? I mean, what are the ruling class so afraid of? You guys like to just throw that out there and get any thoughts on that?
Oh, come on. I mean, there has been a class war going on in this country for at least 30 years, and to call it a war is being generous. It's a slaughter. I mean, it's a completely one-sided war that the 1% has overwhelmingly won. They have, I think, exploited workers since 1970. The average worker has not seen any increase in real wages. So an entire generation has basically been stagnant, while profits have exceeded their wildest hopes and dreams. Then in, I guess, 1994, with the World Trade Organization and China's most favored nation status, we've seen just sort of the hollowing out of American manufacturing, good jobs going overseas. Again, this is like steroids for profits, but it's crippling the middle class here. What happened since then is an unprecedented accumulation of household debt. I mean, we have students coming out of college with $40,000 in debt. 1/4 of all homes are underwater on their mortgages. Credit card debt is maxed out. So middle class families, not seeing any increase in their real wages, have turned to debt to sustain that American dream. And I think now we're finally seeing, the straw has broken the camel's back. You just can't use debt to continue if there's no actual growth in wages and there's no improvement in the job situation. That I think is a big part of what motivated that broad segment of the population to start coming out and complaining and saying something's wrong here. This just is not working anymore.
It seems like, of course, we've talked about this issue many times on Labor's Worldview about the increased influence of corporations and their money on our elected officials. And it seems like, we're going back, or we actually have gone back to the era of the robber barons, the late 1890s, early 1900s, to where basically one halfway, I guess, conscious lawmaker said that the U.S. Congress, the floor of the U.S. Congress and the Senate was more like a glorified whorehouse. It was an auction. Basically, they could get by votes of legislators. It was like an auction, the highest bidder, And do you think of course, we've come to the conclusion that we've returned to that point. And when that happens, what recourse do citizens have that, our working class, which is 99% of the population of one form or another, including retired people or students. What happens when our representatives no longer represent us? Your thoughts?
You want to take this?
Well, I think it's time that we start talking about replacing representatives that don't represent us. And it's disturbing. For better or worse, and almost definitely worse, Americans, I think, focus on the executive branch as sort of an outlet of, well, Congress is just always bad, so hopefully in the next 4 years we'll have our chance at that. But the corruption that's gone on in Congress, arguably has gone on in the executive, but is now, to an extent, with the super PACs, that the same thing's going on there. I think I read last week less than 200 people had been funding the majority of the super PAC money that's going around in the Republican nomination. So it's amazing the extent to which money has completely corrupted not only the Congress, but now just our political mechanism as a whole, the election process. So I think unless we address elections and how they're financed, it doesn't matter if we're talking about Congress or the executive. We're not gonna get around these problems.
Yes, indeed. In fact, there's a free publication in Champaign-Urbana called the Public Eye, and it comes out about every other month. And it's a real interesting article in here about done by a man named Manuel Goldstein, and they have a whole breakdown here. And I'd like to show the viewers this if they could pick up a copy. In the article, he's got a breakdown of corporate contributions to Republicans and the Democrats, and he outlines, he first starts with the banks and the financial institutions, then he shows the contributions of the major weapons manufacturers or defense contractors, which I think is a really misnomer, but anyway, and then he shows the contributions done by the private health insurance industry, and then last but not least, the contributions done by media corporations. And what's really interesting about this is that a lot of people think that the Republicans are the ones that are, they incline for, favoring corporations and the wealthy and stuff. But, these numbers here, and it looks like this is from going back to 2010, for the 2010 election, and farther, but it shows that the financial sector donated to the Democratic Party 60%, as opposed to 40% to the Republicans. Weapons manufacturers about 50-50, more or less. depending on the company. The private health insurers favor the Republicans slightly, but very slightly, like about 52% for the Republicans, 48% to the Democrats. And last but not least, the big media companies favored the Democratic Party by a 3-to-1 margin over the Republicans. So, I mean, this article, I think, it shows in black and white that it's both political parties that are being corrupted by this money. And that this has become a country not of the people, by the people, for the people, but a country of the corporations, by the corporations, for the corporations. And so what does that make us, the common working citizen?
Well,
I know it's a loaded question, but
well, one of the
I better not answer that. You guys do.
one of the statistics that I throw out often on the radio show is that there are 2,500 paid lobbyists just for the financial sector, the finance industry on Capitol Hill, and that's 5 paid lobbyists spending approximately $500 million a year to influence the votes of 200 or 300 or 400 congressmen and senators. So we can't possibly have a representative democracy when just that amount of money and that number of lobbyists are involved. We also were very concerned, not just on the show, but the movement here in general, and I think the movement nationwide, was very concerned about the Citizens United decision by the Supreme Court and what influence that would have on all future elections. And we're starting to see that with the super PACs that you mentioned. A tiny number of people, not even 1%. I think it's something like 0.2%, are the percentage of the population that maxes out on campaign contributions. So we're talking about a tiny, tiny segment of the population really supplies all of the funding for elections. And you mentioned, well, if they're giving it to both parties, I think you have to ask the question, are there really 2 parties, or is it really just 2 faces of one party? I've heard it called, the party of Wall Street is in charge. It just wears, a red or a blue sweatshirt, depending on what day of the week it is. So, we're really, as you pointed out, we're really at the mercy of a tiny number, less than 1% really, that's deciding how our government is going to vote. And more frequently, we're seeing votes that benefit corporations at the detriment of the working class.
For the viewers that don't know what the Citizens United case is all about, it was really done, first of all, I think it was the Murdoch Corporation did an hour documentary on Hillary Clinton and just blasting her. It was just basically an ad, tearing her apart. Not that she is an angel, but when you consider who was doing it. And the ACLU stood up for the documentary, really was paid advertisement for being presented. And of course the Supreme Court went along with that. Now that morphed into unlimited amounts of money can be paid into the elections. And they don't even have to specify. David has the specification numbers here that's in the public eye for 2010. But now they don't have to list that.
So we have no way of tracking it.
We really have no way of tracking this at all. As Deep Throat told Bernstein, or Woodward rather,
During Watergate?
Yeah, during when he was giving the information to Watergate, he says, I can't tell you that. Just follow the money. Follow the money. And we're not allowed to do this now. And also Citizens United basically codifies earlier laws that make corporations people and with free speech rights, and money is speech. The more money you've got, folks, the more free speech you have. So what does that say for the working class? The less money you have, the less free speech you have. And it's just really, it's like the Republican debates, is anybody really watching them? I mean, it's like some sort of dog and pony show or a clown ballet.
Yes, if I didn't know better, I'd swear Barack Obama had this all arranged just to make him look better. But anyway, speaking of free speech and what venues we have for it, let's talk about your radio show on WFT. As Jim said earlier, it's from noon to 3 p.m. on Saturdays. Talk about, first of all, we kind of know, I think, why you started it, but let's talk about what you've done so far and kind of some of the more recent topics you've talked about and kind of the general format and where you would like to go with it.
Okay. Well, we started with a lot of discussion of the documentary Inside Job by Charles Ferguson, because it just really does a great job of laying out how we ended up where we are in the financial crisis with deregulation of financial industries and the power of lobbying and then the consolidation of mortgages into these debt objects and then the credit default swaps that were then leveraged on that. It does a great job of laying out how it happened and who's responsible. And so we thought that was a good place to start, since I think at the beginning most of the sort of furor and outrage in Occupy was about the financial crisis and the fact that the banks were getting bailed out and that people were being foreclosed on. And so that's where we started, and we went from there with reviews of different documentaries by John Pilger, Adam Curtis is one of our favorites.
Yeah.
But we do a lot of just sort of current events, both locally and nationally, that relate to Occupy. And we've interviewed some guests, like Danielle Chenoweth was former Urbana city councilwoman who played a big part in the Prometheus radio project, and so she came on to talk about that. Also a former lefty at 90.1 WEFT. And so we should say our show's from 12 to 3 on Saturdays on 90.1 or streaming at weft.org. And we've also had some other interviews.
Yeah, I think when we first started, there was a lot of sense that we really had to do some catch-up. You know, we had to do our homework, so to speak, and figure out like a lot of the things that had led up to the financial crisis, which really, like I said, was sort of the straw that broke the camel's back, and I think directly led to, you know, the outrage about the bailouts and of course the recession and the downturn in jobs. So a lot of folks, you know, were angry that we were talking to, you know, in the GAs and in the committees, but now suddenly trying to figure out exactly what had happened. So initially we were mainly talking about sort of esoteric subjects like credit default swaps and you know, banking regulation like the Glass-Steagall Act and things like that. And I don't know if that's exactly the most thrilling subject to talk about, but it seemed like it was, you know, the topic of a lot of conversations we were having outside of the show. So we started talking about that. Recently, I think we've sort of expanded out to just a much more broad description of issues of concern to the 99%. So we've, you know, obviously talked a lot about economics, but we've been moving, I think, as politics has, you know, sort of kicked to the front with the Republican primaries that you mentioned. And all of these, you know, draconian sorts of legislation. And we're just constantly trying to tell people about, you know, what's coming down the pipe. Who would have heard about the NDAA? It was a Defense Authorization Budget Act, and yet it had a rider that has, you know, terrifying implications for civil liberties. So we had to talk about that, and then SOPA and PIPA. We've also been talking about peak oil and energy policy, and also sometimes the wars. It just seems like there's an infinite supply of things that actually have to be talked about that the corporate media really doesn't care to inform you about. They'll mention it, but they don't really tell you what you need to know or why it's important or what the effect is.
Yeah.
They don't frame it at all, which is why we oftentimes refer to people like Charles Ferguson's Inside Job or Adam Curtis's BBC documentaries, because they're actually taking a very long-term, and I guess I use the word holistic view about how all of these different factors that may seem esoteric are all part of one sort of overriding trend, and that is this consolidation of wealth. We haven't seen this kind of wealth inequality since 1929 in this country. The overwhelming power that corporations now have, the increasing power of the military-industrial complex to drive our foreign policy and engage in endless imperialistic wars. All of this is part of the same thing, and they're just really different faces of the same problem. So that's really what we've been trying to do, I think, is touch on everything that really relates to the concerns of the 99%, both here and, you know, nationally and globally.
And we've also been really lucky to have the opportunity to interview some great people in town. Like we got an hour-and-a-half interview with Patch Adams,
Yeah.
and
okay.
it was great.
Serious case.
And Actually, we ended up playing a bit of it on our show, and it had to do with peak oil and the end of growth and societal implications. So even with guests like Patch, we were able to span the gamut of what we were discussing.
I'm glad you brought up Patch because we don't want, it's very easy to fall into just sort of a very negative mode where you're constantly complaining and you're constantly outraged, and we do a lot of that. But there's also, I think, a different kind of spirit that sort of pervades the Occupy movement and the people that I've talked to, which is we're really trying to find an actual hope. A lot of people want to change things before it's too late and are really fighting and committed to fighting. But they don't want to necessarily just hear 3 hours of negativity. If I wanted to do that, I guess I'd be Rush Limbaugh. So we try to avoid that.
The one on Rush this week was this girl, Susan Fluke. Fluke was not allowed on a committee, this all-male committee, who was discussing contraception and its use in schools and hospitals, and she wasn't allowed to talk about that. And then Rush Limbaugh calls her a slut and a whore. And for his fine and tireless work, a whole bunch of his advertisers withdrew. Now, they probably, since then he got up and he apologized and all this. But I mean, what's scary is that so many people watch and believe this guy. I mean, just as a joke, he's fun to watch. He's an idiot, and he's something to laugh at. But people really take him seriously, and this is scary.
Well, Jim, I'll have to slightly disagree with you on that because, frankly, Rush Limbaugh, the numbers, the stats have proven that his popularity is not that great. And, it's become, the corporate media has become, it's not what the people want to see, it's what the advertisers want to air because of their advertising dollars. And I think this is just a perfect example of, one of the symptoms of our problem here is that the people aren't running things, it's the 1%. But getting back to your radio show, where would you like to go with it? I mean, as far as some future ambitious projects or, what you plan to maybe have coming up here, maybe as guests or topics?
Well, Matt had been discussing possibly creating a Kickstarter account for us.
What is that exactly?
Well, right now, we're not getting paid and we have no budget, so that sort of limits what we can do. Kickstarter is a website that's basically designed to foster financing for nonprofit or creative or artistic ventures, and there are a lot of musical groups that are trying to raise money to do demo albums. But I've seen radio shows in the public interest that need a budget have also set up projects on Kickstarter, and this is just a way that lots of people can kick in a couple of bucks, and we could raise maybe thousands of dollars, and that would really go a long way to improving sort of the production quality of our show, which right now is very low budget, obviously, and a little bit amateurish, but I think in a very lovable way.
Oh, I don't think so at all. The first couple of 3 shows were, but even by the 3rd show, you guys pretty much had it nailed. And Mick Wolf did a lot of help there the first couple of shows.
Yeah.
Get you guys going, and I think he did very well by
Mick fast-tracked us, is the way he put it. He kind of wanted to see this thing happen before maybe the interest dissipated, and the first couple of shows he really kind of held our hands and got us through. I'm sort of intimidated still by running the board. It looks like a control panel for a 747 in there. But luckily Sean's had some experience at WRFU previously, so he's kind of our technical guy.
Yeah, luckily we had another awesome community radio station in town that let me cut my teeth there on their board that was slightly less complicated, and so we're really blessed in that sense in this town.
Doing our Illinois World Labor Hour show on Saturdays right before your program, it's like, we don't have hour, is no big deal. It's like, but you guys are real marathon runners. I mean, 3 hours every week. I mean, and the content's great. I mean, my hat's off to you. I mean, it's just really commendable how you're able to do this week after week.
Well, mine too, to be honest. And you keep the show rolling. There's really hardly ever any dead air time. You play some songs. All of which I like, and then okay. Well, no, I do actually, but recordings, of people giving lectures and things like that. I've been kind of fascinated with Lawrence Lessig right now talking about Citizens United. He seems to think that it's going to take a constitutional convention to pull off, and I sort of agree because, we have not been able to pass even the Equal Rights Amendment for women, the ERA, back in the 70s when Carter was president. So I don't, state ratification is one thing, but a constitutional convention may be that. But I've been thinking about that. Well, why not whole constitutional Congress elected by, let's say, various constituencies, unions, Occupy, anything else, and just rewrite the bugger from day one. It's like, it's not that the Founding Fathers didn't do a good thing, but it's gotten to the point where it has been made moribund. And the Credentials Committee would not allow any Democrats or any Republicans or any 1%ers in. This is the People's Constitutional Congress. So I've been giving that some thought.
Okay. Well, Jim, that's good. In that vein, I heard that in the Vermont primary elections that there was like 7 or 8 towns in Vermont that actually passed that resolution to advocate for a constitutional convention to overturn Citizens United. Some hope. We all need that, and humor occasionally and everything. But so I'd really highly recommend anyone to tune into their show from noon to 3 on WFT 90.1 FM or WFT.org, which is streamed live. Let's go to the larger Occupy movement now. I'm not the only one, but a lot of people predicted that once the cold weather started hitting in most parts of the country, that this would kind of put a damper on the Occupy movement a bit. But I was really thrilled to see that all over the place, including Champaign-Urbana, it just moved indoors and basically started doing some discussions, planning, recruiting new people and stuff. So let me ask you, where do you see the nationwide Occupy movement go come here in, say, spring hits, nice weather comes back in, say, mid-late April?
Well, I hope that people continue in the vein that they had been in the early Republican primary process, where they were mic checking people who had bad policies. I think that's really what we needed, and that's what I was sort of...
what do you mean by mic check, just for some of our listeners that might not know what that is?
Okay, so for instance, if somebody is giving a speech in a public auditorium and you have a group of people, say, it doesn't even need to be that large, 10 or 12, you could essentially go and with your own voice force an issue or a question to that person saying mic check, and then having the rest of the people with you echo that, forcing sort of a natural amplification that can't be ignored in that sort of setting. But when I was talking earlier about what got me involved in Occupy, and I was saying there's sort of this urge to get involved in political discussion, that was exactly what seemed to me to be lacking. I'd be sitting at home watching the State of the Union. That's a terrible example of something that you could easily get frustrated at. But just, why is everybody clapping? Why isn't anybody saying that's a terrible idea? And so that seemed to me to be exactly what was absent from American political discourse. Like hecklers basically saying, maybe the rest of you are just sheep, but let me tell you, these are terrible ideas, and I should at least have to be addressed in this setting. And so I'm hoping that with H.R. 347, maybe that will become more difficult. But I think that's exactly what I would like to see is when Rick Santorum starts talking about getting his hands on women's bodies, people saying, no, that's a terrible idea, you don't know what you're talking about, and forcing the issue in public so that people know, oh, not everybody agrees with these terrible ideas, I don't have to go along with them.
Now, back in the 60s, we called mic checking heckling, the other term you used.
It's a little bit more orchestrated, I think.
Right. And I remember one time at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, the Young Socialist Alliance went to, we were the Truth Squad, to mic check Norman Thomas, the socialist candidate for president, who was supporting the Vietnam War, calling himself a socialist. That was my first bust, actually. I got thrown in overnight for that. But, you have to take your... have a first bust, your baptism of fire, so to speak. But, you have no civil rights if you don't act You know, you have to test them all the time. You can't take them for granted, and we're losing them quickly, and we have to fight back. Without resistance, they've won.
To touch back on what you were saying, Dave, earlier, I kind of agreed with you. I didn't see that the movement would be able to maintain these outdoor occupations through the winter, and we never actually did really succeed in having a permanent encampment here. But I did suspect that what was going to happen is, as we moved indoors, they would think they had won. You know, as they cleared out these encampments in various cities, they thought we all just went home and went back to watching TV. And I think instead, what we've done is actually much more effective, is sort of moving into a phase 2 of now actually getting things done in working committees and working groups. The radio show is a great example of something that kind of came out of the media committee. We're actually now putting together a committee that's going to be supplying a column to the public eye. So we're looking at a print media as well. But there's lots of planning going on around different local issues now, and I think that's really what they intended, is initially in phase 1, a lot of public attention for the crisis and the issues and pulling people together and instilling in them this participatory democratic model, this consensus building model that we use in all of the GAs. And now we're starting to take that model and those connections and say, what can we do to actually make a difference locally? So I think what we're probably going to see in the coming months, not just an increase in the interest in the political scene, but also a lot more locally directed activism toward issues around mass incarceration and the expansion of the Champaign County Jail, which is something that a lot of people here are very concerned about. And many other sort of local issues related to workers' rights and the ability to organize at places like Flexingate. So we're going to see, I think, a lot of different things come out in the spring, and they're all going to be sort of labeled Occupy. So we may see a morph into a phase 2 that's a lot different from what we saw originally.
Okay, when you said Flexingate, there is this is a major issue in the community. Could you talk about Flexingate for a little bit, please?
Well, I don't know if we have been given the green light to say everything, but I would say that there's been a lot of meetings, and a lot of people in the Occupy movement are ready, willing, and able to lend a lot of support to this organization organizing within the workplace.
Okay, now, what is Flexingate? Where is it located, and what does this plant do?
It's located at 1306 East University, I believe, in Urbana.
That's right.
And they manufacture bumpers for cars. And the issue is that those workers are trying to clean up their workplace and make it a safer environment, I think, is the main issue. But like Matt said, we're kind of waiting for them to put the first foot forward, and then we'll be ready to follow them with whatever action they want to do.
Yeah, I think that's really the issue, is that we can come together and supply sort of manpower and public support and participation at rallies and speak-outs for groups, you know, like the Flexingate workers, but also other nonprofit groups or other social change or reformist groups locally working on their own particular issues. There are some groups that we would really like to be more closely associated with. One that we had just a brief encounter with, which was very productive, was See You at Home, which is a homelessness advocacy and service organization here locally in Champaign. So there are lots of issues around which we could coalesce, and that all are really related to the concerns and issues of the working class and the 99%. But there are a lot of people that have been sort of, you know, fighting the fight for many years and not getting the traction, not getting the support from the community. Rather than us just sort of charge in and say we're angry about this and that, we really like to sort of help advance the cause for all of these groups. And I think all of us pulling together have a lot more power and can actually maybe get things done or change policy. So that's really what we would like to see happen in the coming months.
Occupy is going to be supporting the Flexingate workers in a big way, I hope, and that'll be starting this Saturday at the Channing Murray Foundation on Matthews and Oregon. And they'll be speaking out about their working conditions there, and there will be a lot of Occupy related people there sort of getting their feet wet in that issue.
I just want to add to the Flexingate issue is that this local plant, I mean, you talk about an issue that has almost tailor-made for the Occupy movement. I mean, these workers are having horrible working conditions. Their pay is horrible. On top of that, the owner of the Flexingate plant's a billionaire. So here you go. I mean, this is it's almost like it's the perfect example of what's wrong with the whole country, and most of the world. So we're going to be having more updates on this. The Flexingate issue is just getting warmed up, and I would agree with Matt and Sean that we don't really want to let the cat out of the bag totally yet, but believe me, you stay tuned to Labor's Worldview, and also tune in to WFT for the Occupy radio show and the other shows, public interest shows on Saturday morning. You're going to be hearing a lot more about this, and hopefully this will provide enough information about what's going on, and like Matt said, to unite the community behind this really worthwhile effort and stuff. So, Jim?
Well, you're a member of Jobs with Justice. How are they helping out in the?
Well,
or shouldn't we go there?
Well, I want to say that for a future show, frankly.
Okay,
but Jobs with Justice has been, meeting with the Flexingate workers and also some other people to, try to get this going as far as more let the community know what's going on. That's the biggest thing right there. That's I think with any of these issues, but especially the Flexingate, the biggest problem we have is getting the information out there and inform the community what's going on just in their backyard, because this is what the 1% want. They want us, first of all, they want to keep us uninformed, and they want to keep us divided. And what information they do provide, we used to call it being a mushroom, where they keep you in the dark and feed you a lot of bull crap, fertilizer, because that's in essence is what the corporate media's task is in this country, is to keep us uninformed. And they don't work for us; they work for the ruling class, because after all, they are corporations themselves, big corporations. And
and the Flexingate workers, aren't they largely immigrants? A lot of them from Africa and French speaking.
Yes, there's four major groups. I mean, you have white workers, African American workers, you have some Latino workers, and then you have a contingent of, like you said, French speaking African workers from the Congo. And it's interesting that there's certain dynamics going on in that plant in which the ethnic groups are played off against each other. I mean, this is like stuff that happened back in the 1890s. This was a common tactic, by the bosses to do, is to divide one ethnic group against the other. So yeah, I mean, here we go. We've got it right here in our backyard. So yeah, you'll be definitely hearing more and more of this. But anyway, we got a few more minutes here and stuff. So I'd like to kind of talk about the future of the Occupy movement some more. Jim, what would you like to kind of ask our guests or?
Well, there's a couple of things that worry me, because I haven't seen, or at least historically, found a successful organization that was leaderless. And then there's been a lot of criticism that the Occupy movement doesn't have a set of demands, and then has been able to elect people to talk to, for example, union leaders, and isn't an elected organization, and doesn't collect dues, and things like that I think are going to have to be cleared up this year for us to go on. That's my opinion. What do you guys think?
Yeah, that's something that I think limits exactly what the Occupy movement as an organization can accomplish. The consensus building model is participatory democracy, but as we've often said, it's very time consuming, and it takes a long time and a lot of effort to actually get decisions made that everybody can agree with and then get movement. So I think what we've sort of seen is that as a phase one, to sort of reinstill the democratic habit in people and get the idea of participating and communicating and building a consensus. But I do think we are moving now toward a much more action-oriented approach. And what we're seeing is sort of autonomous or spontaneously forming work groups around issues like Flexingate or the jail that aren't quite as large. They're able to be a bit more mobile and a bit more proactive with smaller groups of much more committed and passionate people, but they still are, I think, following this democratic model. That was one of the things that I remember somebody saying at one of our early working group meetings, that they had heard somebody who they would have labeled as a progressive or even a liberal saying, I'm just not sure I believe in democracy anymore. And I really think that that's true for a lot of people. They've become so jaded and just sort of disillusioned with the way our institutional governance is going that they've kind of given up hope on the whole project. And I think really what we've accomplished with the first phase of Occupy is showing people that you can actually show up at these meetings and have your say and be part of a group that actually is working toward accomplishing a better society. Now, tactically, how do we go about doing that? We're going to start seeing a lot more smaller, more passionate, more locally oriented issues and groups forming. And I think that's really what we have to do.
But of course, the nationwide issues affect us locally, so it's kind of a dynamic that kind of goes back and forth, wouldn't you say?
Oh, clearly. One of our first big actions was a protest at the local branch of Chase Bank. And that was clearly, motivated by the bailouts and the financial crisis. But I remember, even as we were doing that, thinking, well, the people that work at this branch, are working class folks. These are not the billionaires. These are not the people who got us into this. So even as we were protesting the policies of Chase Bank, several of the Occupy members went in to the bank and actually I think gave some flowers and some candy to the workers in the bank and said, we're not against you at all, we're on your side, but we are against sort of what you represent here today. But that's sort of like you're talking about the national issue. Chase is a great target locally and a lot of the big banks are. But what can we really do at a branch of Chase Bank? We had a Move Your Money campaign to tell people to move their money out of the big banks and into local credit unions. So we're trying to figure out ways to make these actions relevant, but it is very difficult, especially at this level, to have an effect on national policy or national corporations.
It's sort of a work in progress, then, you're saying, more or less.
Yeah.
I think so, and the nice thing is I'm not in charge of it either, so I'm sort of waiting to see what people are going to come up with. You say it's leaderless. I guess the flip response is, well, actually it's a movement of leaders. Everyone in it is sort of setting their own course and trying to get other people to coalesce around their ideas, their suggestions, and their passions.
Yeah, like the old industrial worker of the world saying, Jim, we're all leaders here.
That's true, the Wobblies did say that.
Yes, and I think this just drives the authorities crazy. They can't, first of all, they can't.
Who's in charge here?
Who's in charge here, yes. In fact, that even happened at the local Chase Bank demonstration, if I remember correctly.
Yes.
A police officer came up, he stood behind me, was talking to a young woman, saying, who's in charge here? She goes, I don't think anyone's in charge. The look on his face, and he just wandered off like he was a lost child. I mean, so there are some advantages to that, but however, that's got, at certain phases, at certain actions, certain circumstances, that's great and everything, and I think, that we all are definitely leaders here, and that it's gonna vary. Of course, there's gonna be times where there's going to have to be spokespeople to talk to the media or coordinate maybe with other groups. But the great thing about that, if you can have it, shifting around, rotating, different people taking different times, because again, you can possibly have a very functional. What I'm hoping to see is a very as practice makes perfect. You start getting a very good functioning movement, and then within that movement, you have the committees that kind of go and, like you said, are very mobile, are very focused, and we could have a really interesting set of gears, like you see it like the inside of an old clock, all the gear wheels all moving independently, but yet they all interconnect at certain points to help make the watch work, and perhaps that's what the Occupy movement's ultimate goal might be, not goal so much, but its function is that it can be autonomous, democratic, and yet such a dynamic group that it'll make social change without having the formal hierarchical structure that unfortunately can be used for bad as well as good, like we've seen here, unfortunately, in our society, how it's come to.
Yes, well, there's still some problems. It's like in a consensus organization, someone can block something, and
I was going to ask about that. Yes,
and it can take a long time if they don't agree to actually get something done. And I've heard this from my son's in Occupy Oakland, and our friend John Ryman, who we were talking about at the beginning. is also, and they have similar complaints. It's really hard to get things done. It's just kind of, it can get in the way. It can be kind of a dictatorship of the minority if they want to do that, rather than an up and down vote. But these are things that I think are all going to get worked out. You know, the hand sign language that's being used, that was started in Zuccotti Park out of necessity, because people couldn't hear all the way across the park because the police didn't allow any loudspeakers. So, you know, a lot of things were invented there that we're using all over the country now, and I think they're appropriate in some places, and especially mass demonstrations where you're not allowed to have any sound system. But anyway, I'm just delighted you guys were here today.
Yes, indeed.
And we got a chance to talk about some important issues. I'm excited about Occupy the Air, and yeah, 3 hours. That's a long time. You got to have some fill in there, or you're going to burn out.
Well, let's hope that. And I'll tell you, you know, that the thing is that there are so many problems. The ruling class have screwed so much up, and that we're suffering for it. That, yeah, I mean, you could easily talk about these issues for 3 hours. I'm just glad that you guys stepped up to the plate and are willing to do this. And thanks so much for coming in. And
Thanks for having
you know,
us.
keep up the good work. And I'll tell you, our hopes and wishes and participation, of course, are with you here. So you've been listening or seeing Labor's Worldview on Urbana Public Television, Comcast Channel 6. And we've ran out of time today, but I think Jim Eyeman has one more thing to say.
Yes, as always, come back next week, stay strong, keep left.
That's right. Okay, again, this has been Labor's Worldview, and we'll see you next week. Power to the people.